Our theme for the month is time. Speaking of time, listen to this headline. World's oldest known person dies at age 118. A French woman believed to be the world's oldest person has died shortly before her 119th birthday. Lucille Randon, a nun known as Sister Andre, was born in southern France on February 11, 1904. She claimed that hard work kept her going and helped her live a long life. In fact, she was actively working until she was 108 years old. Well, there's a time to be born and a time to die. And with that said, there's nothing else to do but tell you the story of Soldier Jack. So after the introductory music, I'll play that one for you. Well, Jack, he'd been off to the war, and he come home with both his arms and both his legs, and he is thankful for that much. There's some fellers come home with a pant leg a floppin' or shirt sleeve pinned up. Jack, he come home all in one piece, and he's glad for that. But times was real hard, and Jack, he needed him a job of work. So as he's walking down the road, when he'd come by a place, he'd go up to folks' doors and knock and ask for work. He'd tell them, he'd say, I can plow with your mules, I can paint your house, I could be a farm hand, help you out some, you just pay me a little bit. But they'd always say the same thing. Oh, we ain't got no money, not since the war. We all poor, we ain't got no money. You have to go on. Jack got so desperate for work, he started offering to do women's work. He'd say, I'd take care of your little babes and cook food, wash dishes, anything if you could pay me a little bit. And the women, they'd say the same thing. They'd say, we ain't got no money, you just have to go on away from here. Jack didn't know what he's going to do. Well, while he's walking down the road one day, he found a sack a-laying there. Well, you never know when you're going to need a good sack. So Jack picked it up and shook the dirt off of it and stuck it down in his breeches pocket and went on his way. That sack must have had some luck in it that Jack couldn't see, 'cause he come around the bend in the road there, and up on the hill there's this big old fine brick mansion house. It had white columns along the front, big old oak door with fancy cut glass in it. Ooh, them folks is rich. They'd give Jack a job of work. He run up there and he grabbed hold of the big brass door knocker and he banged on the door. And you could hear echoes all through that place. There wasn't nobody a-living there. Jack figured they must have got killed in the war. He turned around, started off back down the road, and he met this feller coming the opposite way. And when that feller got up next to Jack, Jack asked him about that big house up on the hill. And that feller, he said, oh, Jack, he said, you ain't from around these parts. You don't know. He said, that house belongs to my family. My great-great-granddaddy built that house way back when George Washington was president. And then when he died, he gave it to my great-granddaddy. When my great-granddaddy died, he gave it to my granddaddy. My granddaddy died, he gave it to my daddy. When my daddy died, he gave it to me. Jack said, well, if that's such a good place to live and all your family lived up there, how come you ain't a-staying in it? And that feller, he narrowed his eyes down. He said, well, Jack, I'm going to tell you. On account it's haunted. Haunted? What you mean haunted? He said, you know, boogers and witches and stuff. He said, oh, you ain't scared of things like that. He said, oh yeah, Jack, I ain't never been off to a war, seen the kind of things you've seen. They something awful up in that house. People try to spend the night up in that place, and they come a-running out, tearing their hair out, and screaming and hollering and carrying on. It's something terrible. Jack said, well, I hate that for you. He started off down the road. That feller watched him go. Jack was a-walking on two legs and a-swinging his two arms. That feller knew anybody come home from the war with all his arms and legs, come home in one piece, he's a brave feller. He called out at him. He said, Jack, I ain't got money to pay you, but them haints in that house, they trouble me so bad. If you get rid of them haints, I'd give you the house to live in. Well, Jack knew you needed more than a house for fine living, so he just kept on walking. That feller give him a better offer. He said, Jack, if you get rid of them haints in that house, I give you the house to live in, and I give you all the farm that goes with it. It's a good farm. You grow all kind of things. Well, Jack knew the price of cotton was going to fall. There wasn't going to be no money in farming for who knew how long. He kept on walking. Finally, that feller didn't want Jack to get away. He hollered out after him with an offer Jack couldn't refuse. He said, Jack, If you get rid of them haints in that house, I give you the house, I give you all the farmland that goes with it, and I give you my oldest girl to marry." Jack said, "Deal." He figured if he had him a pretty woman, he'd be set for life. So him and that feller, they spit and shook on it. Jack was going to get rid of all the haints in that house. That feller gave him a key, and Jack collected everything he needed to spend the night. He went up to that place and stuck a key in the lock and turned it round, and when he pushed the door open on creaky hinges, he looked in on a fine place. Oh, they's all kind of furniture covered over in dust ruffle. And this wasn't no handmade stuff. These was all store-bought things that come from France on the train. And way down at the end of the hall in the great room, there's a big old stone fireplace. Jack went down there and he laid some sticks up in the fireplace. And just for his to touch some lucifers to them sticks, there's a big voice come down the chimney and said, "Jack, I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jack said, "Well, be glad you ain't me." He blew that match out, got that fire burning good. Then he laid a frying pan up on that fire, and he put a slab of bacon in there. He's going to fry it up for his supper. Just about time that bacon was crisping up good, big voice come down the chimney again and said, "Jack, I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jack put some of that bacon in his mouth, and he said, "Well, be glad you ain't me." He went right on and eat up that bacon. Then it was time to go to sleep. Jack didn't want to leave that fire burning unattended, so instead of going upstairs, he just got that old sack he had found out of his pocket, stretched it out there on the floor, and he lay down on that sack. And just before he drifted off to sleep, he heard that voice again, "Jack, I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jack yawned big. He said, "Well, be glad you ain't me." Jack went off to sleep. Jack wasn't afraid of nothing. Not on the top of God's green earth or underneath it neither. In the middle of the night, something tried to get in that place. Jack heard something scratching up the bricks on the side of that house like old lizard might climb up a rock wall. He heard something throw a leg across the copper guttering and shinny right up to the shingles to the top of that roof, and something went a-skittering across the ridge pole, and something climbed up the chimney bricks, and something was a-climbing down through the chimney flue. The smoke couldn't rise, and all that smoke turned and started boiling back out the mouth of that fireplace and filling that room up with black oily smoke, and something cut loose and come a-falling down through the chimney flue, and bam! Big red devil fell out in the fire, and Jack said, "Woo, Lord, I wouldn't do that if I were you." He snatched up that sack, and he said, "Wickety-whack, into my sack." That old devil went shoom right down in that sack, and Jack cinched the top of that sack up and held on. Now, most folks who'd seen a devil fall out the chimney, they gonna run. But not Jack, He heard 3 voices, so he knowed there's 2 more big boogers up in there somewhere. He sat real still. In a little while, right before the cock crowed, right before the dawn broke, bam, bam, 2 little devils fell out in the fire. Ooh, Lord, they's uglier than that first one. He said, "Wickety-whack, into my sack." Both them devils went shoom right down in that sack, and Jack cinched the top of that sack up, and all of a sudden the dawn broke and the cock started to crow, and Jack knowed he'd got all the haints out of that house. He run out in the yard and he shook that sack up, and them old devils was a-horning and hoofing each other and cussing and carrying on. Jack drug that sack down to blacksmith's shop, and he told them boys, he said, "Get your hammers and start a-beating on this sack, and don't stop till I tell you to quit." Well, they grabbed up hammers, they went to flailing on that sack, and the blood and the fat and the fur and the feathers was flying every which way. And when they emptied out the sack, they wasn't nothing left but a pile of ashes. So Jack, he got rid of all the haints in that house. And that feller, he kept his word. He give Jack the house to live in, all the farmland to have for his own, and Jack and that purty girl, they got married, and they had all kind of young'uns, and Jack, he lived good after that. But then, that girl he married took sick. Oh, she looked a sight. She's all pale, and her lips was blue where she couldn't draw a good breath. Her young'uns was all gathered round the bed a-crying 'cause their mama was about to die. Jack come in the sick room. He had an old sack. He stretched out on the foot of the bed, and he said, "Wickety-whack, into my sack." All them young'uns looked around. They didn't see anything stir, but Jack just took that sack, tied a cord round the top of it, walked out of the room, whistling a happy tune. He seemed glad about whatever he'd done. Jack had caught death up in that sack. He caught old death up in that sack, and after that, that girl of his'n got better. Why, by morning she felt so good she got up and cooked breakfast for all them young'uns. Jack took Death in that sack out to the side of the house and flung it up in a big old tree. If you used to walk past Jack's place at night, you could see that sack hanging from a tree limb, and you could hear Death inside moaning and groaning, trying to get it loose. Jack never would let it go. After that, they wasn't nobody around Jack's place got sick, had no trouble. Everybody lived good. Then a long time after that, Jack was out in front of his place, and he is looking down the hill on the road where he had walked along when he was a soldier coming home from the war. There's this old granny a-hobbling along. She is a-wobbling along on 2 canes, had her head all tied up in a rag. Her eyes is a-rolling around in her skull. Oh, she looked a sight. Jack said, "Granny, what's wrong with you?" And she said, "Well, Jack, I'm 147-year-old. "Lord of mercy, Granny, how'd you get to be so old?" She said, "Well, they tell me some fool round here got Death tied up in a sack. I can't die. It ain't natural to live this long." Jack felt sorry for that old granny woman. He knowed what he had to do. He climbed up in that big old tree, and he got that sack loose. When he got back down on the ground, he ripped it open. You could hear a big moaning sigh as Death flew up in the air. And when Death settled down over the ground, all them old people started dropping. That old woman just fell out in the road right there where she was. And Jack, he fell out right next to her. Oh yeah, Jack, he'd been living about 85 years, so it's time for him to pass on. Now Jack ain't got that big house. He ain't got that pretty girl. Ain't got no money. All we got about Jack's them stories we tell. And I reckon that'll be the end of them too.